to the parliament to enact other laws that stream from the constitution that are very specific to these vulnerable groups and specifically women. So from that we have very many pieces of legislation that entail issues around women's rights. So I'll give an example of some of these laws. We have the Domestic Violence Act that specifically addresses, domestic violence.
Big issue.
Exactly. So we also have the Female Genital Mutilation Act that specifically addresses female genital mutilation. You realize that there are certain aspects of women's rights that are unique to women based on these negative norms. So for example, female circumcision is not something that applies to men. So that is why the law is very specific.
And disagree.
At least it will not have the word female in it. Yes, so we have the Female Genital Mutilation Act. We also have the Trafficking in Persons, where they're looking at certain practices within the framework of trafficking that have specific application to women. And so you find that these small pieces of legislation address specific areas of women's rights, but also within other legal frameworks, other laws, you realize that there are specific aspects that promote the rights of women, that promote equality, that promote non-discrimination, that promote elements of equity.
And even us as individuals, as men, as women, what do we need to do? Or what does the law tell us to do? Maybe we could start from the government.
Yes, ultimately, of course, protecting the rights of citizens is a mandate of the state.
Yes.
So by citizens, we include women. And the law specifically puts this burden on the state because the state is the overall governing body of all the citizens of Uganda. So it has to protect and promote these rights. It's not enough to have them in the book. The state has to take all steps necessary to ensure that the women to whom these rights accrue enjoy them fully and enjoy them in an environment that is enabling. So that is why the state has to make commitments to build the institutions that will promote these rights, to ensure that they allocate resources to these institutions, that where rights have been violated, people can go for protection, people can go and reclaim their rights, so that the overall mandate lies with the state. But of course, the responsibility to also ensure that women enjoy their rights rests with each one of us, including I as a woman and every member of the society, to ensure that the women, that first of all we recognize that these are vulnerable people, and also to ensure that we create equal opportunities for these groups of persons. So whether it's the girl child, whether it's the women in the workspace or in the informal sector, or whether it's disabled women, or whether it is the girl children that are prone to abuse in institutions of learning, we must ensure at all times that we are creating opportunities for them to participate, for them to express themselves and make decisions at all levels. And in Uganda, of course, we have institutions that have particularly been set up to promote these rights. We have a whole Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Within there, of course, there are so many other, smaller, vulnerable groups whose rights are being protected and whose interests are vested within that ministry. We also have the Equal Opportunities Commission that really oversees issues of equality and ensuring that, all of us are enjoying equal rights at different levels, whether at government institutions or even non-governmental institutions as well. We also, of course, know that civil society organizations partner with the state to ensure that they enhance available structures that promote these rights. So I spoke earlier about, the fact that ActionAid is running shelters. They are running it in collaboration with the Ministry of Gender. So that means those shelters are places where the citizens whose rights have been violated can run and can get justice as well. Of course, the courts, the parliament, these are all, government institutions that have the mandate to ensure that these rights are fully enjoyed and also are promoted as well.
Okay. You mentioned earlier on about affirmative action.
Yes.
And sort of tickled my mind because there have been people arguing that perhaps where we've reached now, it has outlived its usefulness. I don't know what you think along those lines as the person who's working in this space for a period of time.
I've had those conversations before. Would I say that we have achieved when it comes to gender equality? No, we're far from there.
Oh.
Yes, we're far from there. The more we evolve, the more we are waking up to the reality of the inequalities that exist all around us. And these inequalities, by the way, do not just apply because you're educated or you're not educated. You live with these inequalities all your life. I can tell you, as a lawyer, as a person who has worked in civil society promoting women's rights, I find myself in spaces of inequality. I find myself in spaces where, you know, you can be discriminated against for one reason or the other. So we live through these inequalities all our lives. The issue is that once we strip ourselves off of affirmative action, then we will be, you know, going 10 steps backwards from where we're from. Because as we speak, even now, there are so many inequalities that exist.
Okay.
The opportunities that a girl in a rural area has cannot compare to a girl in an urban setting. There are so many layers of inequality that still exist, that are even increasing now, given the circumstances that we experience. So in my opinion, we still need the affirmative action in our law. Yeah.
That's a good point to go for a break. Viewers, you're watching You and the Law, the COVID edition, and today we're discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on women's rights. With us in studio is Mercy Grace Munduru from FIDA Uganda, a member of FIDA Uganda, and currently working with Action Aid Uganda. Let's go for a break. We'll be right back.
For human rights to be respected, protected, and fulfilled, relevant government programs must actually work. Medicine should reach hospitals, oxygen should be there, health workers should have gloves, teachers should be present. Now they are mostly absent, and they have left the profession, a good number of them. They are into trading. So things must work. If things don't work, human rights are not respected, are not protected, and are not fulfilled.
COVID-19 has tested our hope and faith as individuals, families, and the country at large. Besides destroying many aspects of our lives, the novel coronavirus has also affected our human rights in many ways. You and the Law, the COVID edition, is a 30-minute weekly television program that focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in Uganda. The program engages experts to explain the importance of rights-based approaches to the success of any public health response to ensure the respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights amidst the challenges presented by COVID-19. You and the Law, the television program, brought to you by Legal Hub Uganda, taking the law to the last mile, is coming soon.
Welcome back. This is You and the Law, the COVID edition, here on House of Talent Television. My name is Jonathan Ochom, your host, and today we have Ms. Mercy Munduru from Action Aid Uganda to discuss with us the effects of COVID-19 on women's rights. Mercy, welcome back from the break. We borrow from what government did, the interventions that were in place, and overall to make a conclusion on how this has been the case. So I would like to pick your mind on that. How has COVID-19 impacting on women's rights?
Ultimately, COVID-19 did affect all of us. I must start with that. The fact that, you know, the ravaging impact was on our society. We were met with a pandemic that we were never prepared for. So I can understand that we all grappled, you know, to fit into the new normal. I'll always remember the first lockdown, the fact that both the state and the citizens were struggling with what to do and what not to do. And I think for me, that was the first moment and what not to do. And I think for me, that was the first moment that I felt the impact of COVID-19 on women. Because I remember in the first couple of weeks, all the helplines were co-opted for reporting COVID-19 cases. So immediately, the hotlines that we usually used for reporting cases of violence were switched off, and they were used for reporting instead infections. That was the first issue. So that means women and children had nowhere to report cases from. So for me, that was the first in terms of when we're responding. But also I remember in the first set of guidelines, we did not have specific consideration, gender considerations, looking at women's unique maternal functions. So women that were expecting struggled in the first, a few weeks of the lockdown to access health facilities because of the strict nature of the restrictions, but also the fact that the security forces were struggling in terms of enforcement. How much do we enforce? The requirements for getting permission to access a health facility were quite heavy. You had to go to an RDC's office and all of that. And there are certain functions of women that cannot wait, that are not time bound. So that was that had a very negative impact on the reproductive rights of women. But broadly, because the way we live changed, there was a very disappropriate impact on women and girls in homesteads. One, we were locked down, so the families had more people than they usually do. And we know before COVID already, we have society that has set out gender roles in our homes. There are certain elements of a woman's life that determine if they are good women or not. These roles are assigned by society, and as you grow, you find yourself fitting within a certain role.
Set up,
and the way these roles are structured, you find women and girls perform similar roles. So what my mother does, I also end up doing this. So this increased the care burden on women. Some of these roles, apart from the domestic chores, is also caring for the sick. We know that this squarely really rests on women. The bigger percentage of women handle care for the elderly, for the sick, and so this really rests on them, and the girls as well. So because of these pressures, you realize that there was a distortion in roles within homestead, and it fueled a lot of violence. The number of domestic violence cases spiked, and I can say this from a point of authority because we respond to cases of GBV. So I can tell you the number of gender-based violence cases went up. Beyond that, there were very many cases of sexual violence, especially incest in homes. Very many young girls that we rescued had survived incest. They were incest within families, by caretakers, by boys in the homes, by their parents. So this in itself made homes a risky venture for young children who were out of school and are also in the home. But also we saw that the reality of the majority of women working in the informal sectors was visible. So Ugandans for the first time realized who really runs the informal economy. So when they were talking about markets and who runs them, who does work in the markets, majority who now had to be locked up in the markets, at the same time also provide for their families. And in this process, most of them were exposed to sexual violence because they were sharing spaces and sanitary facilities with men in most of the markets. But also just the risk of disease, sleeping in that open space and being able to, fend for a living was a challenge. I remember one case where a lady was working in the market, and then she would send a rider to deliver food for her children. And then the rider defiled the daughter, the eldest daughter, who was 8-year-old, an 8-year-old. So the risks associated with that was also immense. And of course, the fact that there was a limitation in the number of people that could stay in the markets meant that there was a significant proportion of women that could not now, earn from what they were doing in the markets and selling of food commodities and all of that. But also the manner in which enforcement was done left a lot of injury on women. I think you saw on the media so many cases where the security forces used unnecessary force on women who were coming to the streets to sell food and do all of this. So the already existing inequalities were further deepened because of the new normal. Not that these things started because of COVID, but they were deepened in that process. But also, most importantly, the digital divide, especially in young people. We know that, of course, schools were disrupted. They're still disrupted. disrupted up to now, and there were now alternatives to learning that emerged due to COVID-19. So many children moved from physical learning to, you know, online learning, and you realize that many children, especially in the rural areas, already could not access learning. This is for both boys and girls. But beyond this, girls were affected differently. Why? Because they are taken up doing household work. They're taken up doing care work with their mothers. So at the end of the day, you realize that girls cannot make time for studies. Girls cannot even access the digital space to learn. Co-opted their girls for marriage just because it was a means for survival in that moment. So, I mean, children have lost a significant amount of time at home, and many parents believe that, you know, this situation may not change, so why don't I just give my daughter away to marriage? That was part of, you know, that disappropriate impact. So you can see that the impact was both economic, social, but also political, because we had elections while we were battling with the pandemic as well, and how many women could give up what they were doing to participate in the election cycle. How many women could leave the household work and go and vote, for example. So that in itself was an issue. But also with the clampdown on some of the NGOs, and especially women's rights NGOs, it was very difficult for women to participate effectively during this period. And most of this was done in the pretext of, you know, trying to enforce restrictions around COVID-19, and so most women couldn't participate.
Mercy, you've given us like a 360-degree analysis of how COVID has affected women's rights, literally from all angles. But I'm curious to know, government put in place a couple of measures, you know, to try to protect the spread of this virus. And I'm wondering, are there those that you think, what's your view of those from the angle of protecting women's rights, the different COVID measures that were put in place? How did those affect or enhance women's rights during the pandemic?
I think as a country, largely we struggle with gender mainstreaming already. It's already a struggle. And so it's no wonder when they were putting together the COVID task force, there was not much consideration given to the gender dimensions. I remember some of the pronouncements by key government officials that were saying that domestic violence is not a big issue.
Sad.
And yet within the first month, there was a spike in the number of cases police was reporting of death from domestic violence. So for me, first of all, not having a gender mainstreaming perspective at the point of, you know, bringing together the task force, both at national level, but also